In the 1970s, a survey plane flew low over the San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico, and a camera mounted in its belly exposed a long series of black and white plates of what looked like empty desert. The ground underneath had been walked for a century by ranchers running cattle and geologists mapping coal and gas. Archaeologists had been digging in that basin since the 1890s, and they had published, and they had gone home. Then the film came back from the lab, and there was a line on it. Pale, faint, running across the scrub and the sandstone in a direction that did not bend. It passed no village, and it reached no river. Where a ridge stood, in the way it went over the top instead of around. And on the far side it picked up the same heading and kept going. Then a second line showed up on another plate. Then a third. Within a few seasons of flying, the plates were describing a network. By the time the survey was finished, those plates held something in the region of 400 miles of roadway, laid out across a high desert by people who had no wheels, no draft animals, and no metal tools. Roads as wide as a modern highway lane, held to a straight line with an accuracy that is difficult to achieve on foot, and roads that arrive, after 35 miles of perfect discipline, at nothing at all. The survey could photograph where the roads went. Plate by plate, it built a complete map of a system it could not explain. The descendants of the people who built those roads could explain it. They had been explaining it for centuries, out loud to anyone who came and asked properly. Almost nobody holding a camera did. The title of this video uses the word Anasazi, and that needs dealing with right now, before anything else, because it is the wrong word. Anasazi is not what these people called themselves. It is a Navajo term, picked up by traders and ranchers in the late 1800s, and absorbed into professional archaeology in the 1930s, where it hardened into the standard label for an entire civilization. The translation is argued over, including among Navajo speakers. It is often rendered loosely as the Ancient Ones. A more literal reading lands closer to enemy ancestors, or ancestors of the enemy, which is not a name any people would ever choose for themselves. Pueblo nations have asked for decades that it be retired. The Hopi word is Hisatsunom, the people of long ago. The term used now by archaeologists and by the National Park Service is ancestral Puebloan. The old word is in the title because it is the word most people type into a search bar. That is the entire reason. From this point on, the people who built the roads are the ancestral Puebloans. One more thing has to be said before the survey goes any further, and it has to be said plainly. The ancestral Puebloans built this, all of it, the roads and the great houses and the astronomy and the engineering. There is no lost race in this story, no vanished super civilization, no visitors from anywhere. There are farmers growing corn and beans and squash in a cold, dry canyon at 6,000 feet, who organized human labor on a scale that still looks impossible from 2,000 feet up. Everything strange about these roads is strange because of what those farmers valued, not because of who they were. The survey's own index cards use the old word in careful pencil, plate after plate. It is a useful reminder of how long a mistake can sit in a filing cabinet without anyone opening the drawer. Chaco Canyon runs for roughly 10 miles through the San Juan Basin, a shallow sandstone trench in country that offers almost nothing to anyone trying to live there. The soil is thin and the water is seasonal and often too alkaline to drink. Winters drop far below freezing, summers push past 100 degrees, and there is essentially no usable timber within a day's walk in any direction. People built the largest buildings in North America there anyway. Construction starts around the year 850. By the year 900, the canyon is the center of its world, and it holds that position for roughly 250 years, until something changes around the year 1150. Pueblo Bonito is the building that ends up on the postcards. A great D-shaped mass of masonry covering close to 2 acres, with at least 650 rooms and more than 30 kivas, rising to 4 stories at the back wall. It was not thrown up in a single season by a single generation. It was built, extended, torn back, and rebuilt across 3 centuries, each generation adding to a plan. Somebody was still carrying in their head 100 years after the people who started it were dead. And Pueblo Bonito is not alone. A dozen more great houses stand in the canyon itself, and dozens more sit far out in the basin, some of them 100 miles away. Built in the same style, to the same proportions, in the same window of time. The masonry is its own argument. The walls are core and veneer, a rubble heart faced with sandstone blocks, shaped and fitted so tightly that the surface reads as decoration. Then, in many rooms, that surface was covered over with plaster and hidden. The care went in whether or not anybody was ever going to see it. Then there is the timber, and the timber ends the conversation about whether these people were primitive. The great houses of Chaco Canyon consumed roughly 200,000 conifer beams. Every single one was cut in the mountains and brought to the canyon on foot. There were no wheels anywhere in the Americas, no oxen, and no horses, which do not reach the Southwest for another 500 years. Tree ring analysis and strontium isotope testing have traced where those beams came from. A large share came out of the Chaco Mountains, more than 50 miles west. Others came from the slopes around Mount Taylor up to 70 miles out. The beams show no drag marks, they were carried. A spruce beam 16 feet long and weighing several hundred pounds, lifted by crews of men and walked across 50 miles of open desert. And then done again and again for 2 centuries. What that takes is not strength, it is agreement. Thousands of people across many lifetimes deciding that this particular canyon was worth it. A society willing to carry a tree 70 miles has already decided that where something goes matters more than what it costs to get it there. Hold on to that, because the roads do not make any sense without it. A Chacoan road is about 30 feet wide. Some measure closer to 20, some closer to 40, but 30 is the working average, and that number is the first problem. 30 feet is the width of a modern 2-lane highway. These roads carried people walking in 1s and 2s with loads on their backs. Nothing about that traffic needed a surface wider than a footpath. The width is not functional. Somebody wanted it that wide. The second problem is the straightness, and specifically what the builders were willing to do to protect it. Where a low ridge crossed the route, they did not curve around it. They cut a stairway into the rock face and took the road over the top. Where the ground fell away, they raised earthen ramps and stone causeways to carry the line across the gap. In places, they edged the roadbed with low masonry curbs, marking out a route through open country where it is not possible to get lost. The straight line was worth more to them than the labor of holding it. The third problem is duplication. Along some stretches, the survey plates show 2 roadbeds running side by side, in places 3, and in at least 1 location. 4 parallel roads, all cut, all maintained, all running the same direction to the same destination. No volume of foot traffic in the 11th century explains 4 lanes. And then there is the fourth problem, which is where these roads end. The Great North Road begins near Pueblo Alto, a great house on the mesa above Chaco Canyon, and runs almost exactly due north for about 35 miles. Along the way, it passes a handful of small isolated structures, with names like Pierre's Site, Halfway House, and Twin Angels Pueblo, which read as way stations rather than settlements. Then the road reaches the edge of Kutz Canyon, a broken country of eroded gray shale, and the builders cut a stairway down the escarpment to the canyon floor. And there it stops. There is no city at the bottom of that stairway, and no farmland, no reservoir, no quarry, no turquoise mine, no salt flat, nothing at all. 35 miles of the most disciplined engineering on the continent, terminating at a cut bank in the Badlands. It is not a one-off. Out across the basin, roads run to a small shrine and stop, or run to the lip of a cliff and stop, or run 2 miles into open desert and simply end, with no trace that anything was ever built at the far end, and no sign that anything was ever intended to be. For most of the 20th century, this went into the record as a puzzle. Maybe the roads were unfinished. Maybe the destinations had eroded away. Maybe they were trade routes whose endpoints had not been located yet, and another season of survey would turn them up. Every one of those explanations rests on the same assumption, that a road is a machine for moving goods between 2 places, and that a road which fails to do that is a road that failed. The assumption is the mystery here, not the roads. The roads were never entirely unknown. 19th century expeditions into the canyon noticed odd level tracks running out from the great houses, wrote a line or 2 in a notebook and moved on. Navajo families living in the basin knew them and had their own names for them. The trouble is what a Chacoan road looks like from the ground. It is a shallow swale in the dirt, a faint change in the vegetation, a scatter of broken pottery along one edge. A person can walk directly across one and never register that they did. From 2,000 feet with the sun low and the shadows long, it is unmistakable. Systematic work began with remote sensing flights run out of the Chaco Center in the 1970s, using aerial photography and infrared imaging to pick up small differences in soil moisture and plant growth. Through the 1980s, the Bureau of Land Management's Chaco Roads Project took the lines off those photographs and put crews on the ground to walk them and confirm them. That is where the figure of more than 400 miles comes from, and that is when the shape of the thing first became visible. Roads radiating out from the canyon, tying it to dozens of outlying great houses, scattered across 60,000 square miles of the Colorado Plateau. The survey record deserves an honest reading, though, and this next part usually gets left out of the retelling. When researchers went back over the same ground decades later, with satellite imagery and airborne laser scanning, they found that a meaningful share of the lines originally identified from the air were not ancient at all. Some were historic wagon roads, some were pipeline scars. Some were two-track ranch roads and seismic survey cuts left by the oil and gas industry, which has been working this basin hard for a very long time. So Western science got this wrong in both directions. First, it looked straight at these roads for 80 years and did not see them. And then it saw more of them than were actually there. Which means the 400-mile figure is a total of documented segments, rather than one continuous paved network. Some of those segments connect to each other, many are short and isolated, and the honest version of the map is stranger than the tidy one. What survived every round of rechecking is the part that matters. The width held up, so did the straightness, the stairways cut into cliff faces, the doubled and tripled roadbeds, and the roads that arrived nowhere. By the end of the 1980s, the survey had gone as far as a photograph can take you. It held a detailed map of a system whose purpose it could not name. So somebody stopped measuring the ground and started measuring the sky. On the morning of the summer solstice in 1977, an artist named Anasazi was recording rock art near the top of Fajada Butte, a sandstone tower standing alone at the southern end of Chaco Canyon, behind 3 heavy slabs of rock leaning against the cliff face. She found a spiral carved into the stone. While she was standing there, a narrow blade of sunlight came through the gap between 2 of the slabs, crept down the rock, and cut that spiral through its exact center. The site is now known as the Sun Dagger. At the summer solstice, a single blade of light splits the large spiral down the middle. At the winter solstice, 2 blades frame the spiral on both edges at once. At the equinoxes, a smaller dagger crosses a smaller spiral off to the side. 3 slabs of fallen sandstone, and a carving placed behind them, with enough precision to turn the whole arrangement into a calendar. And the calendar was not only solar, the larger spiral has about 9.5 turns, and shadows cast by the rising moon track across those turns, as the moon's rising point drifts north and south over a cycle lasting 18.6 years. That cycle is called the lunar standstill. It cannot be noticed in a season, or a year, or a decade. Detecting it requires somebody watching the same horizon and recording what they see across roughly 2 human generations, then handing the record forward to people not yet born. In the late 1980s, the slab shifted slightly, most likely from erosion around their bases caused by visitor traffic on the butte. The dagger no longer falls where it fell for 1,000 years. Fajada Butte is closed now to everyone. Once researchers knew what to look for, the pattern turned up in the architecture. The central wall running through Pueblo Bonito is aligned almost exactly north and south, and its long face runs east and west. Casa Rinconada, the great kiva on the south side of the canyon, has its main doorways set on a north-south axis with an accuracy measured in inches. The great houses at Pueblo Pintado and Quinbenayola are oriented to the limits of that same 18.6-year lunar cycle. 100 miles north at Chimney Rock in Colorado, a Chacoan outlier sits, where the standstill moon rises exactly between 2 natural rock pinnacles, and its construction dates line up with the standstill years, which changes what the Great North Road is. A road that holds true north for 35 miles and terminates at a stairway into the Badlands is not a failed transport route. It is a line drawn on the ground in the same language as the lines built into the walls. The alignment is not a feature of the road. The alignment may be the whole purpose of it. A road that goes nowhere useful is only pointless if a destination has to be a place. It is worth being careful here. The solar alignments are broadly accepted. Several of the lunar claims are still argued over, and some researchers think the pattern has been pushed further than the evidence will carry. That argument is ongoing and healthy. But when archaeology arrived at a ceremonial reading of Chaco in the 1980s and 1990s, it was written up as a breakthrough. It was not a breakthrough. It was an arrival, roughly a century late, at a place where other people had been standing the whole time. Around the year 1150, the canyon empties out. Construction stops. The great houses are closed up, some of them ritually, with doorways sealed and rooms deliberately filled. Within a couple of generations, the center of the ancestral Puebloan world is quiet. The popular telling calls this a disappearance. It calls these people the vanished ones, the civilization that walked into the desert and was never heard from again. That framing is not a small error. It is the most repeated falsehood about Chaco Canyon, and it has done real damage. They did not vanish. They moved. Drought, deforestation of the surrounding country, shifting politics, and reasons that were theirs and not ours pushed the population out of the basin and toward better water. They went east to the Rio Grande Valley and west to the Hopi Mesas, to Zuni, to Acoma, to Laguna, and to the northern pueblos. Their descendants are alive today, in those same places, and a great many of them have never been asked anything. Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Picurus, and other Pueblo nations carry detailed migration histories. Clan accounts of arrival from named places to the north, ceremonial obligations that reference specific landscapes. Chaco is not a ruin in those traditions, and it is not a mystery either. It is a chapter with a name. The Hopi geodesist Philip Tualatztiwa, a man who spent a career in professional surveying, before turning that eye on his own ancestors' work, describes a Chacoan road entering a great house as anchoring that house in spiritual space. Not connecting two towns, but anchoring a structure into a system of directions and ancestors and origins that the buildings themselves are already expressing in stone. And this is the point where the survey record has to stop. Much of what Pueblo nations know about these roads is ceremonial knowledge, held by particular societies, and it is not public. It is not withheld because it is uncertain. It is withheld because it is not for outsiders. Where a tradition is closed, the honest thing is to say so and go no further. That silence is a boundary, placed deliberately and filling it with invented detail. Would repeat the survey's original offense in a louder voice. What can be said in public has been said for a long time. In recent years, the laboratory has caught up to it. In 2017, researchers published DNA results from burials in one of the richest rooms at Pueblo Bonito, showing a single maternal line running through those burials across roughly 3 centuries. The finding was significant. The way it was done was not acceptable. The work went ahead without meaningful consultation with the descendant nations whose ancestors those were, and it drew sustained criticism from Pueblo leaders and from archaeologists. Compare that to what happened in April of 2025. A study initiated, controlled, and led by Picurus Pueblo itself compared 16 ancient genomes from their own community with 13 from living tribal members spanning about 1,000 years. It found unbroken genetic continuity between the Picures of today and the Picures of the past, and it found that their closest ancient relatives were the people buried at Pueblo Bonito, about 170 miles away. The Pueblo already knew that. Their oral history said exactly that. They commissioned the study because a genome is the one form of evidence that federal agencies and federal courts are obliged to take seriously, which brings the survey up to the present because Chaco is not a closed file. It is a living sacred site sitting on top of one of the most heavily drilled oil and gas basins in the United States. In 2023, the federal government barred new leasing on public land within roughly 10 miles of the park. That protection is now proposed for revocation, with a draft environmental assessment released this month, and a public comment window closing in days. The nations are not united on it, and flattening that would be dishonest. The All-Pueblo Council of Governors and the Hopi tribe oppose the revocation. The Navajo Nation supports it, arguing that Navajo Alatis who hold mineral rights inside that 10-mile ring were cut out of the original decision and stand to lose income they were counting on. Those are two descendant positions, both grounded in real obligations to real people. That is what a living site looks like, not a museum. Go back to Plate 1. An aerial photograph did exactly what an aerial photograph does. It recorded a line in the dirt and left the line unexplained. No amount of better film, sharper optics, or higher resolution was ever going to develop an answer out of that negative, because the answer was never in the ground. It was in a language and in a set of obligations, and in people who were still alive and still holding both. For most of a century, the roads of Chaco Canyon were filed as an unsolved mystery of the American Southwest. They were only unsolved in one archive. The other archive is spoken. It is held by the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Picures, and the other Pueblo nations, and it was never lost at any point. It was simply never opened by people who did not think to knock. The roads are still out there tonight, 30 feet wide, still straight, still running true north. Across ground that is currently the subject of a federal comment docket with a deadline on it. 900 years ago, somebody decided that direction was worth more than distance, and organized a nation around that idea, and cut a stairway into a cliff rather than bend the line by a single degree. The survey closes here, the road does not.